welcome to another booktube video from me, Lauren, from Lauren and the Books. Stretch. I just said to David, I'm just so tired all the time. Why? Is it because I've just been indoors all the time? Is that what's making me tired? Anyway, less of that and more wrap-up talk. So, today's date, David, 10th of April. I've read 10 books so far this month. So, and actually, the whole way through the year, I've been doing mid-month wrap-ups because I've been really reading loads of books. I've read 70 books already this year, which is amazing. Like, we're only not even a third of the way through the year yet. Well done, me. So yeah, this is a mid-month wrap-up, and I'm hoping to continue with reading a book a day for the rest of April. It would be nice. I mean, let's see. Like I said, it's the 10th, but I've read... Yeah. So, yeah, I may well do it. Who knows? But yeah, let's start with the books that I've read in the month of April. Just trying to get comfy. It's also really cold and I've got a t-shirt on. I should have put my jumper on, really. Right, first of all, so started the month reading How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Sherry Jones. This is on the Women's Prize long list, otherwise I would never have heard of it. I gave this 3 stars because whilst I found it pacey and sort of readable, it didn't capture my attention like I hoped it would. And also, and this, when things like this happen, like what I'm about to discuss, when they, like, my personal feelings towards subject matter, like, mean that I give a book a higher or a lower rating. I don't know, it's weird. I feel like I'm maybe going to do a video about my thoughts on, like, my thoughts on current events affecting, like, star ratings, because this has a lot of violence against women in it and it's sort of relentless, really. And I was reading this, I mean, I'm never having a good time reading about violence against women, but I was reading it just after that week. So if you remember, there was yeah, I finished this on the 1st of April, so there was a week where there was a hell of a lot of violence against women in the news headlines, and I read this and I was sort of like, oh, loath to go back to it, really. But yeah, I didn't love it, and I hoped I would love it, and I didn't. But yeah, it follows an armed robbery, which actually ends up being a murder. It's not planned to be a murder, but it ends up being a murder, and a baby born on that same night. And it follows the people who are involved in the armed robbery and the baby being born. And then, sadly, that baby goes on to die. So there's a hell of a lot of trigger warnings in here. But yeah, I guess it showed a side of Barbados. It's set in Barbados, I should say, which I hadn't really read about before. And I thought the characters themselves were quite complex. There was a lot going on, a lot of backstory to all of these characters and developed. But overall, I think I just found it fine. And I've said 3 stars, but I think maybe 2.5. So yeah, I didn't love it, sadly. Itchy nose. David, you make me a cup of tea, please? Go on. Next up, poetry collection, My Darling from the Lions by Rachel Long. Now, I'm about to say 2 things about poetry collections. I've got to get another poetry book. So the first thing is that whenever I read, I don't think I'm very good at reading poetry, and I felt like this since school. At school, this poetry we studied was war poems, which wasn't something I was interested in, and I've never sort of found my groove with poetry. Weirdly though, and I'm about to go on to this, I really enjoy reading novels in verse, but like, poetry collections are just not my bag. However, my experience of reading them, I always make them really nice. So for example, I sat in the bath, read this in one sitting, read some of them aloud, read some of them in my head, like, enjoyed it, and like the experience itself like really counts towards my enjoyment of the collection. But looking back now, and I'm looking back at my notes that I've written here that the poems themselves are about sex, sexual awakening, hair and dating. But I don't really remember much about what was in here. I remember there was one poem which is about, it's called, I was going to say something to do with Victoria Beckham, the Sharts and Victoria Beckham. And yeah, I have done some like little, where I've tabbed some poems that I liked, but looking back on it now, I'm not finding things in here where I'm like, oh yeah, I loved that. So yeah, I gave it 3 stars, but in reality, anything that I'm considering forgettable, I've told myself I'm not allowed to give it more than 2 stars, so yeah. And from one 2-star book onto the next one, which Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This is the book that we're reading for my book club with my pals over Facebook. And actually when they said we were reading it, I was like, oh, I've already read that, maybe I'll revisit it. But I hadn't already read Everything I Never Told You. I'd already read Little Fires Everywhere, which is another book, and actually I ended up enjoying Little Fires Everywhere more. So this is about a young girl called Lydia Lee who goes missing. And this book looks into the events that lead up to her disappearance and the events that follow her disappearance. But this isn't a thriller or a mystery book. It's much more of a sort of family saga where it looks into like the dynamics of this American Chinese family. And while some bits I was like, oh yeah, I'm into that, other bits I sort of really passed me by. I listened to it on audio. But yeah, the last third I found much pacier. And had like some revelations and stuff in which moved the book along for me and made me enjoy it more. But yeah, the rest felt a bit slow for me, and I know this is an unpopular opinion because I know it's really, really popular. And actually when I put my review up on Instagram, a lot of people said, oh, I preferred this to Little Fires Everywhere, but I definitely preferred Little Fires Everywhere. You alright, David?
Yeah.
What'd you drop?
Oh, just some pepper. Just some pepper.
Nothing major. So yeah, gave it 2 stars. Now next book I gave 1 star, and that was No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. And again, this is a book that would never have come into my like I wouldn't even known about it if it hadn't been longlisted for the Women's Prize. And yeah, this whole thing went completely over my head. Like, I can't even really tell you what it was about. I've since been told that the first half of the book is to do with, are people's tweets, which are just put not in the way where you would think they were tweets. They're just sort of like little tiny paragraphs. Like, the whole thing, I was trying to grasp some sort of plot or understanding or like anything, and like I really, really don't know what it's about. Like and yeah, it's about technology. There's like some stuff in there about a dictator who I assumed was Trump and then has now been confirmed to me is Trump. But yeah, I just did not enjoy this. It went way over my head. I felt really sort of out of my depth. And I get a bit annoyed when I read books like this. Like, do you ever get this when you like totally don't understand something? I feel really left out. Like, I felt really like, and like, it was only short, which is the reason I finished it. I mean, I rarely review books at 1 star because the only books I tend to finish, if I'm reading a 1 star book, I would think, I'm giving up on this. And the only books I tend to finish are books that I'm reading for a book club. Or this was really short. It was like 140 pages. And after the first part had ended, I thought, oh, well, maybe things will pick up now and I'll understand it a bit more. So the first part, and then it didn't. But I was like, well, I'm 70% of the way through. I may as well finish it. But yeah, really, really didn't understand it. Really, really didn't know what was going on. Bemused me. Next up is the aforementioned novel in verse. This is Punching the Air by Ibi Zoboi and Youssef Salaam. And yeah, as I said, I really, really enjoy novels in verse, and I guess they just really, really work for me, which is unusual because I don't really tend to get on with poetry. And I'm yet to read a novel in verse that I haven't enjoyed. There's just so much sort of plot and feeling and emotion pulled through on like very little on the page, and they just really work for me, and I'm keen to read more. So if you've got more that you'd like to recommend to me, please do. I've read sort of all the big hitters like One and Black Flamingo. Oh, another one I read this year which I really liked was Run Rebel. That was very good. Just having a look to see, because they're all on my top shelf because I normally hang on to them because I enjoy them so much. But yeah, so this was no different. I got as much enjoyment out of this as I have done the other novels in verse that I've read. This follows Amal, who has been incarcerated for a crime that he didn't commit, and how he's being unfairly treated in the American justice system. But also Amal also loves poetry and artwork, and that really shines through, particularly like as well as loving novels in verse. I really like it when they're sort of inventive with the way things look on the page. That really brings a lot to me, which is another reason like I'm so surprised that I don't get on more with poetry, because this sort of thing really, I'm like, oh yeah, that really affects me. So yeah, and like pages like this. But I really thought this was great. So it's written by Ibi Du Bois, who I've read Pride by her, which is a retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and is all about sort of gentrification of New York. But Yusef Salaam is one of the exonerated 5, so he's got sort of first-hand experience of what it's like to be incarcerated for a crime that you didn't commit. And yeah, I just thought it was really great, and I really enjoyed it. I gave it 3 stars. 3 stars. Woo! Dropped it. Next up, 5-star book. Absolutely thought this was fantastic. This is Natives by Akala, and this was just so good. So after reading for the first time a few years ago Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race by Renee Edo-Lodge, and then re-listening to that last year, I've been on the hunt for a book which talks about race and racial discrimination and black history in the same sort of detail and the same sort of references to UK race, racial discrimination, UK black history, as Why I'm No Longer Talking About Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I've really got an ass about face way of saying that, but basically I was looking for a book that discusses black history in the UK. This book is it, and like this has got such really relevant examples in all sorts of walks of life, and like things that really got me and David talking. So for example, John Terry, who said a racial slur to one of the footballers on his team, and then was allowed to go and be captain for the team, even though he'd essentially called somebody a racial name, like a racial slur in the workplace, and how he sort of was celebrated, and there was backlash when they said he wasn't going to go on the, like, so there's sports, there's also sort of things about theatre. So when, oh my god, I've forgotten her last name, the actress who plays Hermione in The Cursed Child, Noma, I think it might be Noma Demesweni, but forgive me if that's wrong, but I'm sure it's Noma Demesweni. So when she got cast as Hermione, and there was like backlash about that, so there's sort of like theatre things and about like stuff more like entertainment and acting. Daniel Kaluuya being racially assaulted on a bus in the US, and yeah, I just thought it was so relevant and so now, but also spans back with history that I had never heard of in my life. This has got the best first chapter of a non-fiction book that I've ever read, and it's entitled Born in the 1980s, and it's about Akala's upbringing and him being mixed race. There's also an amazing chapter in here about him sort of realising that his mum was white, and that sort of like what that had on his relationship with his mum and with his peers and things like that. What also I found really interesting, so like everything about this was so good, but this is written, it's published just as Trump got his presidency. I can't actually find the month that it was. But yeah, so it's written, it doesn't say, and the bloody sticker is over, the library sticker's over the date. But this was written, like, I think Trump has just been named president. He isn't in the White House yet, but it's just happened. And the predictions he has for Trump's presidency are really interesting to read because they all come true. And like, not in an obvious way, like, oh, Trump's gonna, like, this is, like, there's just real, like, specifics in there. Akala himself is a broadcaster, journalist, rapper, activist, and he is so good with words, and this book is so well done. I can't recommend it enough. I really loved it. And I think because there's a lot of like dates and stuff in there, I'm definitely going to revisit this as an audiobook because Akala reads it out. But I think if I was offering you advice on how to come to this in the first place, I would probably recommend going to it as a text first, just because there's a lot of like dates and things like that. But yeah, thought it was absolutely amazing. Really loved it. 5 stars. And then the next up is another 5-star book, and sort of there's been a lot of contradictory views in this video about poetry, but then I got sent and read on the day that it arrived The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman, and this was an inaugural poem that Amanda Gorman read at Joe Biden's inauguration, and it's got a foreword by Oprah Winfrey. Now the foreword didn't do much for me. I don't really know, I don't feel like there's much of a sort of relationship for UK people with Oprah Winfrey. I know she's a powerhouse and she's almost like a way of life over in the US, but yeah, so there's a foreword for her. But this poem that Amanda Gorman has written, like, I don't know much about poetry, but I really do know when something moves me, and this really moved me, like particularly the last lines, and I actually put them up on my Instagram stories afterwards, and so many people got in touch saying that they loved this poem, and then I went and watched her read it out. I'd already seen her read it out when we watched the inauguration, but I watched it again, and so many people got in touch and said, oh my god, I love that poem. Someone I know said, oh, we're getting that poem printed on the wall of the sixth form common room, and just like amazing. And there's this last line which says, for there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. And I'm just like, oh my god. But the whole thing is fantastic. And yeah, I guess if I'm gonna really love poetry, it needs to be something that really moves me and sits with me, and this really did both of those things. So I gave that 5 stars. Loved it. Next up is a book that I read on my e-reader called This Train Is Being Held by Ismay Williams. I read this for the the Reading Women Challenge. This is a book with a biracial protagonist. And this is a YA romance between a dancer called Issa and a baseball player called Alex, who's a baseball player, but he's also a poet. And it's set mainly on a train, which was something that I hadn't read before in terms of romance or YA books. Like a lot of that, they meet on the train, and then a lot of there before they get to know each other. I mean, a lot of it is on the train. I would say like 70% of this book set on the train, which was new for me and I thought was sort of a great setting. I also thought the mental health rep in here was pretty good. Issa's brother and mother have mental health problems, bipolar, and her mother's mental health problems are never really given a sort of a label, but her brother's got bipolar. And I enjoyed the Spanish throughout. Both Issa and Alex speak Spanish at home, so that was really fun to read. But I'm not sort of big keen on something that I've noticed that happens in romance and YA books, is that the alternative love interest, so Alex's alternative love interest, so when things, as is always happens in YA books, when things sort of get a bit just sort of touch and go really with him and Issa, his alternative love interest, Kiara, is sort of put up as like the anti-Issa, and like everything about Issa is the opposite of what Kiara's like, and like she's almost portrayed as a bit of a villain when she's not a villain, and I think, oh god, that just feels like a bit of a cheap shot. And yeah, I gave it 2 stars and I thought it was fine. Itchy shot ankle. There we go. But yeah, 2 stars. And then next up, last 2 books. Consent by Annabelle Leon, which was a book that I read, which is on the Women's Prize long list. I would never have picked it up if it hadn't appeared on the long list. And yeah, I was taken by surprise actually, and I will insert the cover either here or here, wherever it is. When I heard the title Consent and saw this front cover, I was like, just assumed it would be about sexual consent. And whilst that does appear, and sort of trigger warnings for sexual assault, the book itself isn't majority about sexual consent. It's about 2 sets of sisters, and one of those sisters in each set needs caring for by the other sister, and both of these stories run sort of separately until at the end when they come together. So I was a bit surprised, I think, when I started reading it, because I was certain it was going to be about something else, especially with a front cover like this. I also really like the US cover as well, because one of the themes that runs throughout the book is perfume and scent, and the US cover, I think, has got a perfume bottle on the front, which I really like that front cover. So yeah, so I like books about sisters, but for me this, I feel like the first half felt a bit slow, and potentially, thank you my love, I can't drink it straight away, can I, because it's a bit hot. Well, I was going to put it there. Okay, put it there. Thank you. So yeah, the first half felt a bit slow for me, and in parts maybe a bit boring, and then like sort of double tragedy strikes, and the plot really picks up from that point onwards. So yeah, I ended up enjoying it, and I've actually like recommended it to 2 people since, even though I only gave it 3 stars. I just feel like it's quite an interesting book. Like, maybe it was interesting for me because it ended up being completely not about what I thought it was going to be about. So yeah, I ended up giving it 3 stars. But like I said, I've recommended it a couple of times to some people already, and I only finished it yesterday. yesterday. I'm filming this on Saturday and I finished it yesterday. And then the last book is a book that I read yesterday as well, and I read this for Cozy Reading Night. You may well have seen my vlog, and you may well have seen me talking about this, and that's I Was Their American Dream by Monica Garib, and this is a graphic memoir of Monica's life being brought up Filipino-Egyptian in America, in an area of California where there's not many white people, and she sort of lives her parents' American dream, really. And I read this and then promptly gave it to David straight away afterwards. How did you find it, David?
I loved it.
David loved it as well, so David read it last night as well. The artwork is amazing, isn't it? It's really, really lovely, and it's got some really nice colours in it, and it's really fun, and she's witty and funny, and it's got like recipes in there, and it's got like rules for games that she plays with her family, and just like really fun little bits, but also really sort of like drives this message of what it's like to be different, and what it's like to have like an Egyptian father and a Filipino mother, both of whom have different things that they like to eat, and different ways that they like to eat, and different religions, and different ways that they behave around the opposite sex, and different ways they're with their family, and like all of that comes into play. And then also Monica later on gets an American husband, and then she's got like this third dimension of like, there's a bit in there where she just agrees that her family can come and stay for like 3 months, and her husband's like, oh, should you not have spoken to me about that before? And she's like, they're family, of course they're welcome. Like, and that's a Filipino way that like everybody, like, you just drop everything for your family and you give money to your family and things like that. It was really, really good fun and really, really lovely, and like I said, like driving home quite a serious message, and I really, really liked it, and I gave it 4 stars, but actually I reckon on reflection maybe this will creep up to a 5-star. But yeah, really, really enjoyed that. So those are the 10 books that I've read so far in April. Can you believe it? I'm hoping that I can continue to read a book every day, yeah, we'll see how it goes. But let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know how your reading's going in April, and I'll see you all again soon for another booktube video. Goodbye.